Hello and welcome to the first in a series of podcasts from the Southeast Comprehensive Center. The SECC works closely with the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina to provide access to information, models, and materials that facilitate implementation of and compliance with NCLB. We build the capacities of states to implement the programs and goals of the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. Today's presentation was recorded live at the 2008 SECC Annual Regional Forum in New Orleans, Louisiana. William H. Guenther is president and founder of Mass Insight Education and Research Institute, an independent, not-for-profit organization focused on improving student achievement in Massachusetts and the nation's public schools. Mass Insight Education and Research Institute, founded in 1997, is an independent nonprofit that organizes public schools, higher education, business, and state government to significantly improve student achievement with a focus on closing achievement gaps. Mass Insight's education reform strategies are defined by two convictions: that change at scale depends on the practical integration of research, policy, and practice, and that only dramatic and comprehensive change in high-poverty schools will produce significant achievement gains. Mr. Guenther is also president of Mass Insight Corporation, a Boston-based public policy research and consulting firm, which he founded in 1989. Mass Insight seeks to keep Massachusetts and its businesses and institutions globally competitive. Through client and leadership networks, the firm shapes public-private dialogues and delivers policy results on issues in which state actions and investments affect profitability, growth, and new jobs. He is a graduate of Harvard College and the New York University Law School. And now, Mr. Guenther.
It's important to start by being a little humbled, and I appreciate the kind remarks about the work we've done, which is based on 2 years of Gates-funded national research, a whole series of focus groups, interviews, meetings, briefings, discussions with people from around the country, and also our own 10 years and more of on-the-ground work in Massachusetts. But the fact is, nobody is getting this right yet. Nobody's getting it right, and you know that. You all know that, and that's why, in fact, we haven't taken the steps necessary as yet, because there is no clear model, and there is no exemplar that we can just turn to and say, let's pick that up and we know we'll have success. This is very daunting work, and again, all of you know this far better than I do, but that's also the opportunity. I think this is one of the most exciting times to be in education in the 20 years or so that I've been working on these issues. There are extraordinary opportunities. You can hate the test or like the test, but the fact is you can't run and you can't hide anymore. The data's out there. We know the schools that are failing. These are the ones where there's no argument about the data, where we shouldn't be arguing about differentiated intervention. These are the failing institutions in education where a lot of kids are trapped in every state. In our work, what we've done and what I hope to present to you today is a framework. It's a way of thinking about turnaround and intervention and identifying some of the work that's been done already, what we can learn from that, and where to go. So what I'd like to do is to do four things. One is to identify some of the schools that are succeeding, or at least the key elements of some of the schools that are succeeding with high poverty kids. And the second, in conjunction with that, is to look at the framework of current intervention efforts and what we know from those. Then I want to look at in the second portion at why those efforts are failing and what's missing. Then I'll put on the table the framework that we've talked about and really what we call the non-negotiables of turnaround and intervention, the things that have to be there on a comprehensive basis if you're going to succeed. And then finally I want to pull all that together into a summary and see whether we can't get into a discussion about some of these elements. And I encourage you, I'm going to wander around, I encourage you to interrupt me, ask questions as we go through the slides. There's a lot of material in here. We've included a lot of detail in the slides because we thought it was important for you to have that detail when you take the slides home, and I encourage you to use them and forward them and do as you will with them. But I'm going to run through them fairly quickly, and I won't touch on all of the detail, but again, I wanted you to have it. There are a few big themes that I would encourage you to take out of all this and remember. The first is that marginal change equals marginal results. If we failed to date in these schools that are what we think of as the bottom 5%, it is because we have not been sufficiently bold. And what's concerning as we look around the country, and we are working with Illinois on a Gates contract out there in the state of Washington. I was just down in Texas with the Communities Foundation doing some preliminary work there. State after state is repeating the failed strategies of other states. Now, there's something wrong with that picture. And we need the political will, and you all need the leadership from your governors and your elected officials to look in the mirror and say, what we've been doing is marginal, it produces marginal results, and it's not going to turn around failing schools. The second big conclusion, I think, from all of our work together, and that really means all of us here, is that we've spent 25 years in education reform focusing on programs, on looking for the perfect math program, perfect literacy program, the perfect special ed program. All of those are important, but in the end, this is about people. And if you don't focus first on a people strategy and not a program strategy, you will indeed fail again. We have to think about people, and that leads you very quickly to, I think, one of the most important points we've raised. And again, all of this is from research and interviews in the field, so all we're doing is synthesizing what we're hearing from your colleagues around the country. And that is that you have to deal with the conditions in which people are working. And if you don't change those working conditions, all of the Virginia turnaround specialists, the principals, single individuals will fail to succeed. The superhero is important if we can find them, but you won't find that on the averages. And we have to allow average principals and just above average principals to succeed as well as the superheroes. And if you don't get to the conditions and change the underlying conditions, that means compensation, it means the incentives for teachers and administrators to teach in tough schools, it means flexibility on staffing. All of those conditions have to be in place. So, first point, marginal change equals marginal results. Second point, people, and that means looking at the underlying conditions. And the last point, I think, is equally important, and that is that schools do not turn themselves around. You need to put in place the right staff inside the school to allow that school to succeed, but you need an outside partner to do this work. You need an outside partner. We are missing the capacity, I think. Let me ask you the question just to start. How many of you think that state education associations, agencies, have the internal capacity to do this work? And how many of you feel you have the resources to do this work? So let's ask a positive question and get some hands in the air. How many of you would be willing to engage in a bold initiative if you had the political leadership behind you? Raise your hands. All right. So the fact is, what's stopping us, and again, we'll go back to this in the slides, is the capacity, right, and the resources for all of you to get this work done. And we would argue that means looking for outside partners to engage in this kind of work. In every other sector in this country, there are people and there are organizations who are professionally focused on doing turnaround work, who spend their lives doing it. There are people, because we know them, in schools, probably in your departments and elsewhere, who would love to go work for an organization that was dedicated to doing this kind of work and spend their life on it. But it's a very different kind of job than a long-term improvement strategy. This is very tough, intense, 2 to 3 years, turnaround, working with people in a very different way on a crash basis, and the people who like to do that do it on a serial basis in other sectors. They do one turnaround, and then they go someplace else and they do another one and another one. But we need organizations as homes for those kinds of people. And right now, what we're doing in state after state across the country is hiring retired principals and superintendents, many of whom are terrific, and sending them off, though, by themselves with a few days training to go into a school, in many cases 1 day a week, if actually the commitment is made at that level, and assuming that that's a turnaround strategy. It is not. It doesn't work. It's failing in Washington State. If Illinois picked it up and tried it, it would fail there. We need organizations, lead turnaround partners that can do this work and work with all of you and work with districts and schools to make it happen. I would argue that national firms, although there may be some that you can consider, are not the answer. And then, in fact, all education is local, as all of you know, and outsiders are viewed with great suspicion, including states, right, and local school districts. So we're going to have to build, and each state is going to have to build its own marketplace. That's not a word that education always loves, but its own marketplace of organizations that do this kind of work and can engage with you and deliver for you the kinds of support and services that produce a real turnaround. And if I leave you with one message, I would say that's the challenge, is to identify organizations that are willing to do this work, interested in it, and provide the state funding and the support to build up that marketplace so that you can succeed. So let me try with these slides. Let's see whether I can walk around here. I'll turn this back on. Can you hear me now? Does that work? Good. Okay. Actually, there it is. It's even louder. So we have, ooh, God.
I'll adjust.
You want to adjust that one? All right, good. We have this anomaly that we've suggested that actually turnaround may represent the biggest opportunity to transform high-poverty schools and make them look the way we know they need to look. That's a much longer day. We know that kids in poverty need a lot more time, not only for academics, for other kinds of support. And we know that schools that succeed with those kids are, in fact, providing that time. So adding 20 minutes a day isn't going to solve the problem. These schools need to be fundamentally different. What's interesting, we think, is that the bottom 5% of schools represent this extraordinary opportunity for transformation in high-poverty schools, and they do because nobody can argue about the data, right? These are schools where 50% or more of the kids are failing year after year on your state tests. And if you focus on those, you can get over that first hurdle of, well, that school's really not so bad. If we just give them a little more time, things will get better. You know, if you had a different set of tests, we'd show that the kids are really doing well when, you know, they're not doing well on your state tests, right? You know all the arguments. But the fact is, these are the schools where there's no argument about the data. These are the failed schools. And if you can get over that hurdle very quickly about the data issues, then I think you can get to this transformational set of questions. So let's define turnaround first, because one of the reasons why we would suggest turnaround organizations don't exist in education is because it's never been thought of, as I said, as a separate discipline. Turnaround is defined probably most of all by time frame. Irving Hamer, who worked down in Miami with Rudy Crew and worked with us on this study, made the point that the conventional wisdom in education is that it takes 5 to 7 years to get change. In a turnaround situation, you have to produce results, at least initial results, within 2 years, we would suggest. And that change in the time frame fundamentally changes the way you think about what needs to get done. So we're suggesting that turnaround is a dramatic and comprehensive intervention in a low-performing school that A, produces significant gains in achievement within 2 years, and B, readies the school for the longer process of transformation into a high-performance organization. Now, we are realistic enough, I think, all of us, to say that a school that has 70% or so of its kids failing year after year is not going to suddenly go to 50% of the kids proficient in 2 years. But it needs to go from 70% to 50% failing, we would suggest, within 2 years. That if you're only producing marginal changes within that two-year time frame, In fact, you need to look to other solutions. So, first important point is, again, I think, to define turnaround itself, to engage then in a debate and a discussion about what that means and what needs to get done to respond to it. This is, I'm going to pick on, is Joan Tuttle here? Joan, are you here? Hi, Joan. How you doing? So I have a watcher from Massachusetts, Joan Tuttle, who was a distinguished educator down here, worked in the southern states, and we appreciate the fact that she's come back to Massachusetts to help us out at the department there. So if I say anything that's off base, she can raise her hand and say that I'm being very unfair. But one of the things we don't mind doing is hanging out our own dirty laundry in Massachusetts. And this was a slide that we used up there to try to prod the department and the governor and others to take more concerted action. But it represents the kind of, I think, results that all of you would recognize. Here's 8 years of intervention. Again, it's a complicated slide. I won't go through all the detail, but this is a middle school in Fall River, Massachusetts. The intervention started in 1998. We run this slide through 2005 when the state decided to take much more dramatic action at that point. But you can see with eight years relatively of improvement plans, discussions with the district, $25,000 to help come up with a new plan, you know, the sort of typical old world Generation 1 interventions, you've gone from 4% proficient to 8% proficient. Marginal change equals marginal results. What's interesting on this chart, what we've done here is to basically every dot on here is a school. This is California, but we've got in the report charts for other states as well. And on the vertical axis, you've got the percent proficient in math. On the horizontal axis, you've got the percent of students eligible for free and reduced lunch. So high poverty to the right-hand side and high performance to the left on the vertical. So obviously the strong diagonal from left down to the bottom at right is what you would understand to be true, which is as poverty increases, performance goes down. What's really interesting, I think, though, and more interesting than that, because that is the conventional wisdom and correct, is the high degree of variability among these high poverty schools. So the answer is, and again, all of you know this, not every school with the same group of kids produces the same results, right? And so what you're seeing is some schools that are outliers with high poverty kids and actually produce better results. This is another way of representing the same point. Again, I happen to pick on Massachusetts, but there's a set of two elementary schools, 2 middle schools, and 2 high schools represented here. Those are totally varying results in terms of academic achievement on the state tests in Massachusetts between schools with relatively exactly the same kinds of kids. So the key question for intervention is to say, how do we take that DNA that's in those higher performing, we would say, high poverty schools, because even the best high poverty schools are not yet high performing, but higher performing high poverty schools, and how do we inject that into a system and actually take this to scale? So first task, as I said, let's learn from the schools that are proving it can be done and take a look at the current landscape of reform strategies. So this should look pretty familiar. We didn't put the word standards up there, but this is basically what the standards movement has been all about. We're going from the old world model of what's being taught to the new world model of what's being learned, of what kids are learning, and going from that conveyor belt to a very student-centered set of engagements that look very much like what a hospital does with a patient, bringing a lot of resources to bear on an individual and taking a look at what the condition is and where that individual stands and what you can do for them. So we've codified, if you will, that kind of approach into this readiness triangle, which I think is actually quite a useful construct. Essentially, we had one of the writers of the report read through every single report that's been done on interventions with kids, turnaround, and improvement, and this is basically the synthesis of all of that material. And what it suggests is that there are 3 legs to a readiness triangle if you're engaging either with kids or with Turnaround. And this is, the way to view this is very much at the school level. So at the school level, you've got the readiness to teach, which is preparing teachers and administrators and the school to be able to deliver instruction. You've got the readiness to learn, which is preparing students, and particularly students in high poverty situations, to have the social supports, the discipline, and the ability to learn. And then you've got the readiness to act, which is this conditions piece. And that's the flexibility and the support and the incentives and the compensation that allows administrators and teachers to actually do their jobs. Now, what's interesting here, and this will look very familiar, I think, to all of you, is that 90% of our work over the last 20 years has been on that right side of the triangle, on the readiness to teach. If you look at $20 billion of spending on outside providers in America, and that's what the number is, starting with the textbook publishers, professional development, all the things that we've engaged in together here, 90% of that or more is on that readiness to teach side of the triangle. And the other two sides of the triangle very rarely get done or get done well. Readiness to act is clearly the charter-like conditions that you see in charter schools. And the readiness to teach, the readiness to learn has been picked up and I think focused on, again, in particular in some of the charter school strategies. So the KIPP academies are a good case in point, where they have focused heavily on developing social skills and support for kids who, in fact, need that kind of support if they are going to be ready to learn. Longer school day is another key piece of that, obviously, both in the readiness to learn, readiness to act. So as you look at your own strategies, again, school level, and we'll look a little bit later in the presentation at how to operationalize this readiness triangle, but if you look at your own schools, I encourage you to take this triangle and this framework and ask yourselves whether all three legs of the triangle are being dealt with equally. Effective schools serving disadvantaged students have these characteristics based on all the research. These elements, again, I think are very familiar to all of you, but we're not putting them in place in most circumstances. Clear understanding of student needs, well-integrated strategies. I would make the point here, and I think I'll reinforce it later. Schools do projects, they don't do strategies. What you see are a lot of competing projects in schools, and you don't see it integrated into a coherent strategy that every teacher can understand and that doesn't require a lot of competition for time and resources between the various projects. And finally, again, the conditions and incentives that support that work. The freedom to act, the incentives, the higher compensation for teachers who teach in our most challenged schools, the professional HR norms, and mission-driven incentives. This was, I threw this slide in here. It's a little bit of a tangent, but as I mentioned, we just got finished doing this work in Texas, or at least some preliminary work, doing a series of retreats with some practitioner-level principals from some of the high schools in the Reform project that the Communities Foundation is running, and then some briefings with the board of the Communities Foundation down there, which is a statewide foundation with close to $1 billion of assets. This was the basic outline we used with one of the practitioner groups for a set of activities. And what was interesting was, we asked them to create a map of the design challenges and basically to identify then priorities and come back to us, and there were 4 or 5 different tables that had different reports, but come back to us and talk about which of these were most important in preventing them from doing the work that needed to get done. And you might think that they'd come back and put resources at the top of the pile. They didn't. Operating conditions was number 1 from each one of the groups. And that was directly tied to human capacity. So that link between operating conditions and human capacity were the first 2 sets of issues, and then resources followed that. Not to say that resources aren't important, but those human capacity and operating conditions issues are the ones that we have neglected. So let me run through, as I said, I wanted to look at the landscape of current intervention efforts. Now on this chart, excellence is the vertical and scale is the horizontal. If you're looking at excellence in terms of high poverty, high performance, those are the individual schools that are up in the upper left-hand quadrant. Again, as all of you know, the challenge we're facing is there are individual schools that succeed, but they are isolated successes. We're not getting to scale. No one is getting to scale. Nobody's taking even small clusters of schools and getting 5 schools, all of them, to raise their performance simultaneously. So that's why you see that isolated performance up there. If you look at the average for award-winning urban districts, the Broad Prize to Boston or Norfolk or other districts that have gotten the Broad Prize, their overall performance is better than the average for high-poverty districts, but it ain't that great either, right? And that's what you're showing in the middle there. And then you've got statewide high-poverty performance, which is obviously the largest scale and the lowest performance. So if you look at the kinds of interventions that we've engaged in, and you look at this on a scale of comprehensiveness on the vertical, and then scale on the horizontal. This little chart is intended to reinforce the point that 90% of our work has been on program change. Does that sound right? Right? So probably the most visible examples of that were the comprehensive school reform efforts in the 90s. Billions of dollars of spending, and the best studies done evaluating CSR showed that 21 out of 24 programs achieved no results. No results. 3 of them achieved results, and they were minimal. So if we haven't learned the lesson that program change doesn't work, the evidence is all there. Go ahead, jump.
Has this been presented to the federal government?
Yes.
Because federal dollars drive programs.
They absolutely do, yeah. Yes, we've done briefings with the Senate and House staff, Doug Messakar and some of the individuals at the US DOE. Right, but keep talking to them. Well, I think they recognize in the NCLB reauthorization, and I'll show you some slides on that, that they need to make some changes. And they clearly need to hear from all of you on that. So CSR, New American Schools, again, you've seen this stuff before. This is what some people refer to as the light touch, right? It's very important, professional development, coaching, but it's not the answer by itself. So same scale, same axes here of comprehensiveness and the scale of the change. And now we're looking at people change, which is the second area that a fewer number of districts and states have gone to, primarily districts, in addition to the program change. That's putting in a new principal, in some cases having a total reconstitution of staff. San Francisco, DC, as 2 failed examples of that strategy back about 10 or 15 years ago when they made the mistake of firing all the teachers without thinking about where they were going to get new teachers from and had to hire back most of the staff they just fired. Not a great strategy, right? Which is not to say, it's not to say that people change isn't important in a turnaround situation. If you have a failed culture, you have to break that culture quickly. You're going to have to change out some of the people. Not because they aren't any good, and this is a really important point because we quickly get into these conversations with the unions about whether or not we're really firing or replacing or moving teachers that are competent or incompetent. That's not the issue. The issue is you got to move some people around if you're going to break a failed culture. And some of those people may succeed very well in another school. But if you can't move people around, you're not going to change a culture quickly. So the final piece, we did program, we did people, and now we're doing conditions, is the change in conditions that we talked about. Very rare. A few states have engaged in some of this kind of work. Again, the Recovery District here is clearly focused on conditions, among other issues. But it's coming primarily out of some of the big city districts around the country. So if you look at Chicago, you look at New York, Philadelphia, that's where you're finding examples. Again, not necessarily comprehensive. They haven't, in Chicago, for instance, gotten the longer day that's critical, and they're working on it in some of the schools that are in turnaround. But they are starting to focus on this conditions piece piece of the issue, which is authority and resources and the incentives linked to mission. So here's, in the management consultants world, the upper right-hand quadrant is the place you're supposed to be. And the fact is, what all of you are working on is New World, or as Rodney put it, Generation 2 turnaround and intervention. And that's a comprehensive approach that affects program, people, and conditions. It's got to get all three pieces. So let's take a look at the root causes of why this hasn't happened. It is an interesting issue because the fact is, we know we've got plenty of research on these few high-poverty, high-performing schools. We know what the elements are, but we're not engaging in strategy to try to replicate those results. So, first point is lack of leverage, we would suggest. NCLB has, as you all know, and we'll put it up there, has a safety valve, option 5. Anything else you think might work, right? And that's basically the option everybody's taking for the most part. So the forcing mechanism is not coming from NCLB, and it's not coming from most states. Lack of capacity. And the exemplars. I would put the two of those together. Again, the first thing that Chris Cook, the state superintendent in Illinois, said to us when we went through this material with him was, so who do I turn to for a partner? Well, they're not out there. So all of you are dealing with this same challenge. If you don't have a partner to turn to and you know you don't have the capacity in your own department, you're much less likely to start doing that work. So that's been a huge stumbling block. And then lack of public will. These schools do not have a constituency that's politically important. This is a risky proposition for a governor, right? It's a risky proposition. There's no success, no track record, and there aren't a lot of middle-class constituents out there who are going to jump up and say, boy, let's get this done. So it takes a bold leader, and it takes having these pieces in place in order to get the work done. Because again, if you don't have the partners, and if you don't have the capacity and the resources, nobody's going to take it on. So we'll take a brief look at NCLB here. We've laid out these NCLB 5 options in a different way than most have, and essentially laid them out from left to right, from light touch to more comprehensive and bold. And we're not suggesting that one or another is more important, but if you're thinking about interventions, you need a portfolio strategy because you don't know exactly what's going to work, so you probably need to be doing 3 or 4 different things simultaneously. The revision option 5 is the anything you think is good is acceptable to us. And that's basically the light touch program change. Reconstitution, which is actually the second option listed, but is over there on the left-hand side, is the people change. And again, though, that hasn't been used significantly, and if it has, it's been in isolation and as a failed strategy. Contract management is turning schools over to a contract manager. State management, which no state wants to engage in, is the state managing the schools itself, right? And finally, there's charter conversion, which is taking schools out of the traditional public school district and putting them into charter status. So now if you take a look at a report that was done by the CEP on California and Michigan, here are the choices that those 2 states made. And you can see the weighting of the choices, and that it doesn't add up to 100 because there were multiple. In other words, they were choosing revision and reconstitution in a number of schools. But you can see the weighting of choices on the left-hand side and the changing people was primarily changing principals. So these were not whole-scale staff changes. And you can see 0 chose state management, no surprise there, and very few on the charter conversions. So these gaps, if you will, these gaps in leverage, capacity, focus on conditions, have led to the following state strategies. And these strategies, as you all know, are insufficient. So what are the reasons? First of all, we would argue you're going to need negative and positive incentives to get people to do difficult work that's outside the norms of their behavior. Somebody's going to have a pistol that says if you don't engage in this kind of work together, something worse will happen, a negative incentive. But we would argue the positive incentives are equally important, that in fact, and this goes back to the worst schools being the biggest opportunity, we need to create a club that schools want to belong to. That schools in Louisiana look at the recovery district and they say, boy, those guys are getting resources and flexibility. This is exactly, as a principal, what I want. And as a superintendent, this is what I want for my schools. So we have to create such an attractive choice that schools are actually choosing to get this kind of state support. Now, that's a fundamentally different paradigm than what any state is seeing right now. The second point is the comprehensiveness, that it's got to be comprehensive. Right now, we're doing targeted strategies with each individual piece. It's not comprehensive. It's not clusters of schools. It's individual schools, one by one. I'll get back to that point. It tends to be sometimes all loose. It's not tight enough and systematic enough on the curriculum that's being used. And finally, there's this insufficient commitment from the state. But again, it's totally understandable because all of you are faced with this barren landscape where you don't have partners and you don't have the resources to get the work done. So here's the challenge, and here's the opportunity for all of you. We're moving to 5,000 schools in restructuring. There are 9 states with 10% of their schools already in restructuring. Some of the biggest states, 4 out of 5 of the biggest states, California, Florida, et cetera, over 10%. Even if you focused on the bottom 5%, you don't have the capacity to deal with those. And that's another key message in here, and I'll get back to that too, but you got to start with small clusters, 5 schools, deal with 25 schools initially, 50 schools max, find the partners. But this is the issue that's going to be on the table in the next 2 years. We've got a window of probably 2 years before NCLB gets reauthorized, and there will be states out there that chart the course for other states. So that's the opportunity. So, third task, we took a look at the high-performing, high-poverty schools, some of the key elements. We took a look at the current landscape. Secondly, looked at the incentives and why they're lacking. Here, why the work isn't getting done. So here's the way to operationalize that readiness triangle that was the school-level set of elements and put that into a context of a strategy. So we would argue that there are 3 C's that help frame this work. And the first is conditions that we've discussed, the second is capacity, and the third is clustering. I'll go through each of these. The capacity is very much about both internal capacity, but as I emphasized, about these external lead partners. So let's talk about the conditions change first. This is, in a schematic, what we think a local turnaround zone looks like. And in essence, what you're doing here is, in fact, taking those charter-like conditions that are outside the district where people, time, money, and program are completely flexible, and you can basically make up the game from scratch, and you're injecting that inside a district. So you're creating charter-like conditions in a zone inside a district, and that means you're getting waivers and changes in collective bargaining contracts and the flexibility to basically look at the adults and have the adults look at each other and say, we're not playing by the old rules. We need a new set of rules to play this game. So people, time, money, program, you need to deal with all 4 of those elements to get this done. If you look at the Rudy Crew and the improvement zone in Miami, where they negotiated these kinds of changes in the collective bargaining contract, and I will encourage you that in those states, and it is interesting in our work in Texas that, of course, coming from the north, we always thought that we were the heavy union states, and down south here, you guys had it easy and had the kind of flexibility that the superintendents up north don't have. Well, I'm learning. And I do understand that some of the statewide requirements and restrictions are just as onerous as some of the ones in the district collective bargaining contracts up north. So where these changes are negotiated, and again, I want to emphasize this has been done with unions in different jurisdictions around the country, not on a statewide basis, but in some of the big city districts. You are putting more money on the table. You are buying a longer day, because that's a critical element, and you're buying flexibility on the staffing. Now, the fact is teachers should get paid more to teach in our toughest schools anyway. So that's, to me, an equitable issue that you put on the table and you can sell. But there's the package. And again, it gets to the point that you can start to introduce in these toughest schools some of the conditions that you'd like to see in the whole district and in the whole state. So if you look at Florida, just a couple of examples here of state actions that have engaged these kinds of issues. Florida's had a very aggressive, as you know, both grading system, controversial, of course, A to F, and then response system in terms of interventions. Those interventions have been focused, many of them, around conditions, around changes in teacher pay, differential pay, reallocation of teachers and leaders. The state superintendents there, the commissioner, have been willing to back up those interventions in some cases by even threatening Rudy Cruz's pay in order to bring Miami around to the particular intervention that occurred there. But they have withheld federal monies and taken other high leverage steps to assure that state actions actually had results. Interesting question that we had a conversation with Eric Smith, the new commissioner down there, a couple of weeks ago on the phone, and he did raise, as a small tangent here, an issue that is important to think about, and that is if you intervene in schools, as Florida has done and most states have done individually, and you fix those schools and you've still got a failed district, what do you do in terms of returning those schools to the district? So you clearly need a parallel set of strategies to engage schools, turn around schools, and then work on the district. We would argue that, and I think all of you would agree, that turning around a whole district all at once probably is a pretty tough challenge. So you've got to start someplace with a smaller base. And picking a few schools in a cluster makes complete sense, but then you do have to have a parallel strategy around the district. In Massachusetts, the State Board of Education in '06 took some very important steps to lay out a set of 10 conditions that needed to be in place for turnaround. These are the first two that were on the list: flexibility around staffing, control of the budget at the principal level. What's interesting, though, is, again, airing our dirty laundry, that this led to some legislative pushback, and the board hasn't fully implemented this program in the turnaround schools. So again, these things look good on paper, but when push comes to shove, you know what the problems are. The pistol and the handshake, this gets at this point that you need positive incentives and negative incentives as well. The Commonwealth pilot project in Massachusetts is an effort to take the conditions that exist in the pilot schools in Boston, which are primarily startups of new small schools, where they negotiated flexibility with the union a number of years ago to provide for different working conditions, and take that model and put it into a turnaround situation for schools around the state. It led to the state saying to these 4 schools and the 3 districts involved that if they didn't agree to a change in conditions, in other words, if the union and management didn't come together and agree on a longer school day, there was more money on the table, that they would in fact go into the chronically underperforming category. So that was the pistol, was if you don't make the positive choice, the negative choice will look even worse. But the fact is, in all 4 cases, they chose to negotiate changes in the contract, put in place a longer day, and create some of these positive conditions. What's missing there is the deeply embedded turnaround partner role. So let's talk for a minute about capacity building. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the internal capacity. This is a summary that our colleague Brian Hassel, who runs a company out of North Carolina, put together from some of the research of the key characteristics of leading principals in a turnaround situation. And these are going to be very familiar to you. Whether it's Jim Collins, get on the bus, these are the kinds of things that people talk about in terms of focus, clarity, mission-driven, relentlessness, etc. The other piece is the one I want to spend a little more time on, which is this outside partner role. So take this graphic and put yourself in the shoes of an average teacher. So instead of looking at that inner circle of one school, think of one teacher. And isn't this what teachers see when they see the projects that schools are engaged in? one project after another, multiple providers from outside who've been hired, special ed, Title I, math, science, English, literacy programs, right? All competing for time, all confusing, some of them redundant. Teachers, administrators administrators in some cases going to multiple evaluation training workshops with 3 or 4 different systems operating. Schools do projects, they don't do strategy. So we would argue that one of the #1 priorities for all of you and for all of us is in fact to figure out who's going to help schools create a coherent strategy. Who's going to integrate all of that confusing landscape into something that's coherent. So here's what we would suggest, seems fairly straightforward, but does not exist. And that is that you need a lead turnaround partner who integrates all the outside providers, that somebody needs to be in charge. Somebody needs to have the general contract, as you would if you were building a house, the general contractor, and all the other guys are subs. All the other guys are subs. Now in Arkansas, where the State Department recognized this problem, they basically said America's Choice is the one we're going to pick, and they kicked all the other providers out of the building in their turnaround schools. They picked one, and I'm not saying America's Choice is the right choice or the wrong choice, but they picked one, and they kicked everybody else out of the buildings. Okay, somebody's got to be in charge. There has to be a lead partner. In its simplest form, this is a school management organization. It's a contract for a group to run a school, and they decide which programs to put in place and how to integrate it, and you hold them responsible for that set of programs and a set of achievement results. But if you don't go to school management, full school management, we would suggest in the consulting world, you need to help integrate all of those outside consultants and partners and providers into some coherence, and you need to have one partner you're dealing with, not 12 or 15. So if you look at the landscape of outside support organizations, here's the way, and again, I'm not going to go through all the detail on this, but here's the way we think it plays out. Again, 90% of the work that's been done has been on the right-hand side in what we would call point solution partners. These are partners, outside providers, who have a discrete set of services for a particular problem, whether it's data, curriculum, PD, whatever, and you're hiring them to do that work, or it could be back office. And there are only a very limited set of, oops, yeah, I'm going to have to go up here because it doesn't, this doesn't work. There are only a limited set of organizations that are doing this more comprehensive work. Again, the simplest form is the school management organization, where you simply put someone on contract and they're totally responsible for all the school functions or for a group of schools. The reform support organization, which we're suggesting is another model. Some of our friends who are at First Things First, again, America's Choice, would probably argue that they were in that category, that they are providing a more comprehensive set of services and can fill this kind of role. We would suggest, though, that as you go forward, you ask yourselves a set of questions about partners. First is, are they lead partner? Do they have responsibility for all of the other outside partners? Second, is there anywhere in the contract with that organization accountability, at least shared, with the school and the district for student achievement? Is that organization willing to put themselves on the line for student achievement? Because 90%, and again, this is, there's a lot of good work being done by those point source providers, but they're on the line for the number of warm bodies they push through a program, not for student achievement. And if we're going to create real partnerships between you, districts, and schools, clusters of schools, the outside partner needs to be on the line for student achievement, at least on a shared basis. And then tied to that, ask yourself, because that's what the outside partner is going to say if you try to put them on the line, do they have shared responsibility and shared flexibility around staffing and around budget? Because nobody's going to sign up for student achievement goals if they don't have flexibility on staffing and budget, right? So, If you look at who's breaking the mold on this kind of work with partners, it's, again, districts primarily, not states at the moment. And states need to get into this act because nobody's getting into this business unless there's revenue to induce you to get into the business. We do not want, by the way, our role in life is to be a strategic partner with a limited number of states, which we've started to work with, and we're interested in doing a few others, and a few big city districts. But we're not interested in being in the turnaround partner business. We deeply believe that we need a marketplace of these partners as we go forward. So if you look at Chicago, the mayor went to the University of Chicago. They hired Tim Knowles, who was Tom Pazant's deputy in Boston, brought him out there, and they've got a group of schools, primarily charter schools, that the University of Chicago is responsible for. AUSL, Academy for Urban School Leadership, is engaged in turnaround work on contract with the city of Chicago and the Chicago Public Schools. They're working with a small cluster, 2 to 3 schools, adding 3 or 4 more. They are bringing in new staff. They're dealing with a union situation, but they required the flexibility to replace all the staff. They wouldn't go into it unless they could replace all the staff, which didn't mean they replaced all of them in every case, but they have that flexibility. New York City, the conceptual structure to Joel Klein's strategy in New York is probably as close to, I think, what we're talking about as any that we've seen, although because he has decentralized substantially, created clusters of up to 20 schools, engaged both inside and outside partners. We would suggest, in all fairness, that the implementation of that strategy probably is flawed in some ways because the clusters are too big. It's up to 20 schools, and there's no organization that has the ability right now to deal with 20 schools. So they need to be smaller clusters, and the partners need to be much more deeply embedded. In Philadelphia, there's a Generation 2 effort going on there, Mastery Schools, which has learned from some of the past failures, outside nonprofit organization, and managing a group of schools there. Again, I emphasize, as we said before, this is very much about a portfolio strategy. You should try a series of things, a series of strategies as part of a portfolio, which should include school management organizations, charter organizations, and these kinds of what we would call RSOs, reform support organizations, and lead partners, but who are truly accountable for student achievement. So finally, clustering. We did conditions, we did the capacity, and now the third C, clustering. This is also a critical point. If we don't do clusters, you're never going to get to scale. States have been doing these as onesies and twosies, as Irving Hamer said to us. You'll never get to scale. And you will not build outside organizations that will get to scale if they're not working with clusters of schools. So the clusters need to be intentional clusters with some strategy behind them. So they need to be a group of schools that has some reason to be grouped. Now that could be a vertical cluster, which is really probably the one on the right-hand side with District E, with a group of schools, 6 schools. Let's say that's a high school and a group of feeder middle schools. And you're doing a vertical cluster, or a middle school with a group of feeder elementary schools, and you're creating responsibility for a continuum and for the pipeline, not just for a single layer within the K-12 system, right? Or you're taking 3 to 5 schools and you're picking a partner who has a particular expertise with, say, Hispanic-speaking kids. And you're clustering 3 or 4 schools, and they might be geographically dispersed, although it's better if they're close because then you can, again, create shared resources through the partner. But you're creating some commonality in that group of schools based on the challenge, the primary challenges that are obvious in those schools. So, finally, let's apply these to a new comprehensive set of structures. And I want to close with this slide and just a couple of other summary pieces. So here's what the whole thing looks like in graphic form. You are creating, and we would argue the first real hurdle to get over is, and particularly because schools and communities like to feel they own their system, you have to create a series of local turnaround zones. A series of local turnaround zones. So this is not about creating a state district, because that's the last thing that most schools and communities want. It's about creating these protected zones within local communities where this kind of very difficult work can get done. And then it's creating clusters. And again, we probably got too many little round circles in there clustered. because we would argue the clusters need to be no more than 3 to 5 schools, but multiple clusters. You're putting in place the conditions, the capacity, and these clusters for support. You've got a lead turnaround partner. And then the final point I want to make here is that the state, and obviously this is very important for all of you, the state turnaround agency and the district support office need to have the same flexibility, the same resources, the same sort of entrepreneurial mentality that in fact we're putting in place at the local level in this turnaround zone. And that means we would suggest a very distinct group within a state department. In its most highly developed form, we would argue that it's probably a separate office that reports to the commissioner, located in a separate physical location with a new culture. I'd use the example of IBM. When IBM was primarily in the mainframe computer business, and they wanted to get into the PC business in the early 80s. They knew that their staff was not going to be able to create a PC. They started a new office in Boca Raton, Florida, and they hired all new staff, and they created the IBM PC down there. That same model we need to think of as a paradigm for state agencies, for districts. If we're going to get out of the compliance business and into the technical assistance business, we need to fundamentally change the paradigm and send a message to schools and communities that in fact we are doing things very differently at the state level. And that means having a new office with a new culture. Can be some of all of you choosing to go work there. But wouldn't you want the same kind of flexibility, waivers of mandates and bureaucratic restrictions, and the same kind of resources that we're talking about for the schools to get your work done? So that's, we would argue, again, tough politically in some cases, but that's the kind of, and again, Louisiana is a good example where that work's being done. Some limited choice, examples across the country. Maryland putting together a breakthrough center. Alabama has created an accountability roundtable. We would suggest looking at the roundtable, which we have, that I think there are 25 agencies at the table. So it's actually exactly the right thing to do, but it's also indicative of the problems, because coordinating 25 different programs and agencies is pretty tough. New York State with a restructuring in the SEA, New York City and Chicago with new offices to do this kind of work. So here's the last slide. 5 steps to get this kind of work done. Create the protected space and an attractive choice. Again, you need the pistol, you need some lever, you need a negative incentive, but the real key to this is creating a very positive choice for schools so that they choose to join the club instead of thinking it's just a label with no response and no resources. Secondly, focus on cohorts. As all of you know, most states will take a limited amount of money and spread it around much too thinly. This work costs $500,000 to $1 million per school. Some of that money can come from, and where it's worked, has come from reallocations of existing resources within the districts. But some of it needs to come from states. This is expensive work. Teachers need to get paid more to do the work, and you need to focus your resources. So take whatever limited resources you have and focus on a small cohort of schools and start there. The other point, as we said, and I think you would all agree, is the capacity isn't there in the partner marketplace, and therefore you can't bite off more than you can chew. Internal capacity, important, clearly important for the long-term effort, but external capacity equally critical with these lead turnaround partners. And finally, looking at all of you, create or anoint an entrepreneurial agency with leverage and resources that comes right out of your operations and will drive this kind of work. You are critical to making this happen. No state is doing this on a systematic basis. There is an extraordinary opportunity right now for states to pick up this gauntlet and do something significant in the next several years. Thank you very much.
That was William H. Guenther, President and Founder of Mass Insight Education and Research Institute for the Southeast Comprehensive Center.